The dawn broke like a wound across the sky, pale and raw, bleeding light over the empty plains. Frost clung to the brittle grass, and the wind came low, carrying with it the scent of ash and old sorrow. She stood beside the station, a single figure against the endless stretch of land, her dress thin and travel-worn, her gloved hands trembling around a small leather satchel. The train had long gone, its iron echo swallowed by the horizon, leaving behind only silence and the dust it stirred. Her name was Clara, though no one in this place knew it. They called her the $5 bride, with a sneer, a bargain made by mail and rumor. She had come west on the promise of a man, a husband she had never seen but who had sent letters written in a careful hand. Now the letters were folded tight in her bag, their ink smudged by tears and travel, and the man, Thomas Hale, was nowhere to be found. The town rose in the distance like a mirage, wooden buildings squatting in the pale light, their signs creaking in the cold. A saloon, a mercantile, a church with its paint peeling like old parchment. No one waited for her. No voice called her name. A dog barked and then fell silent. She drew her coat closer, though it did little against the chill, and started down the dirt road, each step sinking into the frost-hardened earth. The townsfolk watched from behind curtained windows and half-open doors. She could feel their eyes, sharp and measuring, as though she were a stranger dropped from the sky, a curiosity to be whispered about. $5, they said. That was what he paid. A wife for less than the price of a saddle. She found the boarding house at the edge of town, a sagging two-story with smoke leaking from its chimney. The woman who answered the door, Mrs. Tully, looked her up and down with a kind of weary pity. "You'll be wantin' a room," she said, her voice rough as burlap. Clara nodded, too tired to speak. She paid with the last of her coins and carried her satchel upstairs to a narrow bed that smelled of dust and lye. When she sat, the springs groaned beneath her like an old horse. For a long time she stared at her hands, pale and trembling, the knuckles raw from travel. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and unkind. That night, sleep came fitful. She dreamed of the sea she had left behind, gray waves lapping against a rocky shore, her father's voice fading into the wind. In the morning, she woke to the sound of boots on the stairs and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The town was stirring. She rose, washed her face in cold water, and looked out the window. The land stretched endless and unforgiving, but there was a strange beauty in it too, a kind of fierce, unyielding grace. She found work at the mercantile, sweeping floors and stacking shelves for a few coins a week. The proprietor, a thin man with a tobacco-stained mustache, said little but watched her with cautious eyes. The townsfolk still whispered. Some pitied her, others mocked. The cowboy who bought her had vanished, they said. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe he'd died. Either way, she was alone. But Clara did not leave. Each morning she rose before dawn, her hands chapped and bleeding, her breath a pale cloud in the cold. She learned the rhythm of the town, the wagon wheels grinding through the dirt, the church bell tolling at noon, the crows circling the fields. She spoke little, but her eyes saw everything. The weary farmers, the widows in black, the hungry children chasing dogs through the dust. One day, as she carried a crate across the street, a gust of wind tore her bonnet loose. It tumbled down the road, and a hand reached out to catch it, a rough, sun-browned hand, belonging to a man with eyes the color of storm clouds. He held the bonnet gently, as though it were something fragile. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, steady. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Thomas Hale. He stood before her, taller than she had imagined, his coat worn, his face shadowed by miles of hard living. "You came," he said, more to himself than to her. "I thought—" but the words died in the wind. There was shame in his eyes, and something else, a kind of longing, raw and unspoken. She took the bonnet from his hand and turned away, her heart pounding. The townsfolk watched from a distance, their whispers rising like dust. $5, they said again. A cheap bride, a foolish dream. But Clara said nothing. She walked on, the wind tugging at her coat, her steps steady, her resolve like iron beneath the sorrow. That night, as the sun sank behind the hills, she sat by the window and thought of the man who had bought her and vanished, and now returned like a ghost. She did not know whether to hate him or to listen. All she knew was that the land had begun to shape her, carving strength where once there had been only hope. Outside, the wind howled over the plains, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of change. The wind shifted and brought the smell of wet earth, the kind that rises when the ground has gone thirsty too long. Clara woke before first light and went to the pump, working the handle until the water coughed up cold and iron. Her fingers burned and then numb. She washed her face, pulled her hair tight, and tied the same worn ribbon at the nape of her neck. The mirror in the boarding house hall was spotted like an old apple, but it caught enough of her to show the pale stubbornness in her eyes. She tucked the letters deeper in her satchel and stepped outside. He was there, leaning by the hitching post with his hat in hand, the morning turning his breath to ghost white. He said her name in a low voice. Clara felt it like a misfired heartbeat. She walked past him toward the mercantile, and heard his boots fall in beside her. "I owed a man money," he said after a time. The words came slow, as if each cut his throat a little. "Could not pay when the storm took my cattle." They were not merely animals, Clara thought, hearing the way he paused. They were memory and meat and a future that had slipped from his fingers like dry sand. He went on. "I left to work it off. Could not write. Shame is a kind of weather. It keeps you inside." Clara kept her eyes on the street. Men began hauling sacks from a freight wagon, their voices sharp in the cold. She told him she had found work at the store. He nodded. "I have a small claim out near the cottonwoods by the river bend. A shack. Not much." It sounded like a confession instead of an invitation. She thanked him for catching her bonnet and said she would think on things. Then she slipped into the dim of the mercantile, where dust motes drifted like seed fluff and the proprietor muttered prices as if they were prayers. Days folded into one another. She learned the heft of flour sacks, the way to cradle glass so it did not sing against itself, the careful tally of eggs in straw. At noon, the bell tolled from the church, and she ate bread with pickles in the back. Her knees hugged close, the taste sharp enough to make her eyes water. In the afternoon she swept, a steady back and forth that cleared a small square of order in a world that would not be tamed. She began to walk home the long way, past the edge of town where the road lost its manners and the prairie opened like a held breath. Once she met Thomas there, riding slow on a horse the color of smoke. He dismounted as though not to startle her and kept a respectful distance. Told her he had patched the roof of the shack with salvaged tin, angled it so the rain ran true. Told her about a black kettle his mother had brought by wagon from Kentucky, how it sang when placed just right over coals. She listened, not because she cared about tin or kettles, but because the telling softened his mouth and warmed the gray in his eyes. He asked no forgiveness. He made no grand promise. Instead, he came by with bundled kindling and left it by the boarding house steps, then walked away before she could speak. He brought a hand-carved spoon, smooth as river stone, and placed it on the mercantile counter with the quiet pride of a man offering the only gold he owned. When she held the spoon, her thumb found the tiny notch near the bowl where the knife had slipped. An imperfection, honest as a scar. The town did not stop watching. A pair of girls giggled behind their gloves. A ranch hand spat tobacco and said $5, the word flung like a stone. Clara kept her eyes steady. The insult slid off her and cracked on the ground between them. The crack echoed in her chest anyway. Work thickened her hands, gave them a kind of blunt beauty. She began to sleep through the night. When she dreamed, the sea was farther away, and the wind over the prairie had a different voice, fuller, as if it knew her name. One evening, after a long day of inventory, she found Thomas waiting with a wrapped parcel. He looked almost shy. "I reckoned you might need this." Inside was a pair of gloves stitched from deerskin, the seams small and careful. The fit was near perfect. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. He studied the dust at his boots, then answered, "My father was a tanner, a patient one. He taught me to listen with my fingers. He died before the war ended, and I left before I was a man. I have tried to keep the way his voice would settle a room." He glanced up, awkward in his own tenderness, and she knew he was telling her the only riches he possessed. They began to speak more, not of love, but of work. What seed to plant when the river fell back into its bed? how to brace a door against the north wind, which herbs kept a child's fever from raging. He asked about the sea she had left and the father whose voice had become oar-strokes fading into fog. She told him that grief was a small house you lived in until your bones learned its shape. He nodded as if she had said something a doctor might write down. When the first true rain came, every roof in town hissed. She met him beneath the cottonwoods where the river ran brown and fast. The trees shook themselves and laughter fell from their leaves. She wore the gloves he had stitched. He offered her a place in the shack until she could decide, not as a bargain, not as an order, but as a hand held out over rough water. Clara looked at the swollen current and thought of the letters in her satchel full of careful promises and empty rooms. She felt the rain soaking through her bonnet, cold and alive. A hawk cut the sky in a single, certain line. She said she would come for a trial of days. No further word given. He accepted with a breath she almost heard, and together they walked the muddy track, the earth clasping their boots, as if reluctant to let them go. The shack stood where the river bent like a weary arm, its banks swollen from the rain. The roof gleamed faintly with tin patches, catching the weak light of dawn. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin gray threads. Clara paused at the threshold, her boots heavy with mud, her breath visible in the chill. Inside, the single room smelled of pine smoke and old earth. A narrow bed against the wall, a small table scarred by knives, a shelf with a Bible and a tin mug. Sparse, but honest. Thomas had swept the floor, laid fresh straw in the bedding, and placed a vase of dried sage on the sill. "It isn't much," he said, voice quiet, almost apologetic. She studied the space, the cracked window panes, the worn boards that held the weight of years. "It's real," she answered, and that was enough. The days passed measured by labor. Clara rose with the first gray light, her hands raw from the pump, her skirt hem dusted with frost. She mended shirts, stirred beans in the black kettle, and learned the stubborn rhythm of frontier life. The wind whistled through the gaps in the boards, and sometimes, when it came hard off the river, the walls moaned like an old ship adrift. Yet within that sound she found something like peace, a steady presence that neither pitied nor demanded. Thomas worked the land from dawn until the last edge of light, his shoulders bent but sure. He showed her how to read the sky, how the thin, high clouds meant a shift coming, how the crows would rise before a storm. In the evenings, they ate in silence, the crackle of fire their only conversation, yet in that silence lived a strange comfort, the kind found between souls who had suffered enough to understand what words could not hold. Once, as she kneaded dough on the table, he came in with a splinter in his palm. She took his hand without hesitation, her fingers steady as she teased the wood free. He watched her face as she worked her lashes low, the faint crease between her brows, and something in his chest softened like thawing earth. "You've done this before," he said. "For my father," she answered. He worked nets, and the sea was cruel. The memory flickered in her eyes, but she did not turn away. When night fell, he would sometimes sit at the doorway, pipe in hand, watching the horizon fade. She joined him once, wrapped in a shawl. The air smelled of rain-soaked sage and distant smoke. "You think it ever gets easier?" he asked. "The living?" She thought for a long moment. "No," she said, "but it grows clearer. You learn what matters when there's nothing left to bargain." They shared little laughter then, only small gestures that spoke louder than mirth, a cup refilled, a coat mended, a word spared when silence held more kindness. Still, a quiet bond began to form, thread by thread, between the work and the watching, between the grief they carried and the life they were shaping from dust. The town, however, did not forget its scorn. When Clara rode in for supplies, the whispers followed like shadows. "The $5 bride," they said, "bought and shelved." She met their eyes without flinching now. In her gaze lived the cold steadiness of the plains, and the gossip faltered in the face of something unyielding. One afternoon, a boy came running from the ridge breathless, face pale as milk. "Flood's coming," he cried. "The river's rising fast." The spring thaw had broken upstream, sending a wall of water down the valley. Thomas dropped his tools and ran. Clara followed. By the time they reached the bend, the river had grown monstrous, churning and brown, swallowing its banks. A neighbor's calf was trapped in the reeds, bleeding in terror. Without pause, Clara waded in, the cold cutting to her bones. Thomas shouted her name, but she pressed on, boots sinking, skirts dragging heavy with water. She reached the calf, cut it loose, and drove it toward higher ground. When the current surged, Thomas caught her arm and pulled her back, both of them gasping, soaked, trembling. For a moment, their eyes met his wide with fear, hers blazing with a strange calm. When they reached safety, the neighbors gathered, breathless with awe. No one spoke the old mockery. They saw her then not as a bargain, but as a soul forged in hardship, capable of standing against the river itself. That night, as the rain eased and the stars returned, Thomas built a fire high. He turned to her, eyes lit by flame. "You saved what I would have lost," he said. "You risked your life for a neighbor's beast." She shook her head. "Life is life. We do not measure its worth in coin." The words hung between them, soft and true. He reached into his coat and drew out the letters she had once written, the ones that had traveled across the miles to find him. "I kept them," he said, "even when I couldn't answer. They reminded me there was still someone who believed a man could start again." His voice caught, rough with shame and gratitude. She looked at him, the firelight warm across her face, and something inside her eased, a knot loosening after too many winters. Outside, the river whispered along its banks, its fury spent. Inside, two hearts battered, unsure, sat close beside the fire, not as buyer and bride, but as equals, tempered by the same relentless land. Spring settled across the valley in slow breaths, the thaw softening the hard edges of the land. Where snowmelt carved through the gullies, new shoots pushed up, tender and green. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and the fields shimmered with the promise of renewal. In that gentler light, Clara moved through her days with quiet purpose, feeding the hens, patching clothes, gathering wild herbs from the riverbank. Her hands bore the marks of labor, but her step had steadied, her eyes grown calm. Thomas watched her from the doorway sometimes, his hat in his hands, uncertain of the words that might match what he felt. She had arrived as a stranger, a name whispered behind shutters, yet now she moved through the shack as though she belonged to its bones. The place had changed with her, less hollow, less haunted. There was bread cooling on the table now, a quilt folded neat at the foot of the bed, a tin mug filled with wildflowers on the sill. Small signs of presence, small signs of grace. The town began to speak differently. Men who once mocked her nodded in passing. Women came asking after herbs for coughs and fevers, and Clara brewed teas with patient hands. When a rancher's child fell ill, she stayed through the night, wiping the girl's brow, whispering songs learned from her coastal home. The fever broke before dawn, and word spread. Soon, folks began to say her name with respect, sometimes even gratitude. Still, she carried her days lightly, as one who knows how fragile mercy can be. Yet beneath that calm, unease stirred. Thomas felt it like a storm waiting on the edge of the sky. He'd been gone when she arrived, gone because of debts, because of pride, and though he'd returned, the shame of it clung like dust that would not wash away. He wanted to ask her to stay, to claim the life they were building not from obligation but from choice, but he feared the asking might scatter what had grown so carefully between them. One evening, as twilight bled across the plains, a rider approached from town. The horse came hard, hooves striking sparks from the stones. Thomas stepped outside, hand on the latch, and saw the sheriff dismount, hat pulled low. "Got a man in from the east," the sheriff said. "Claims a debt on your land. Says he holds the note." He handed over a paper, its ink dark as spilled blood. Thomas read the words and felt the weight of them settle like iron. The creditor he thought he'd paid still lingered, hungry for what little he had left. Clara found him later, sitting by the hearth, the paper crumpled in his fist. She touched his shoulder, and he flinched, not from her hand, but from the shame he could no longer hide. "They'll take the land," he said. "Everything I've tried to build. You should not be bound to a man who can't keep his word." She knelt beside him, eyes steady in the firelight. "I came here with nothing but faith and my own two hands. If this land must be fought for, we'll fight together." Her certainty startled him. No promise, no plea, just truth, plain as the soil. In her voice, he heard the strength of the tides, the patience of stone. And something within him shifted, the old fear loosening its grip. The days that followed were heavy with work and worry. Thomas rode to town, bartered labor for coin, spoke with neighbors who owed him small kindnesses. Clara kept the fields in order, her back bent beneath the weight of necessity. At night they spoke little, yet their silence was not empty. It was shared, a quiet vow. She would watch the fire die down, the glow fading across his face, and think of how sorrow had shaped him, how endurance could carve a man clean. Then came a day when the town gathered for meeting, the sheriff reading the claim aloud. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some curious, some cruel. Clara stood beside Thomas, her chin high, her dress plain but clean. When the creditor sneered and called her the $5 bride, the words struck like stones, but she did not flinch. $5 bought no shame, she said, her voice carrying through the hall. It bought a chance for a life worth living, and that life stands here. The crowd fell silent, moved by the quiet fire in her tone. A rancher Thomas had once helped stepped forward, offering to witness his labor, to swear the debt paid in kind. Others followed, men and women whose lives Clara had touched, their words piled like stones against the tide. The sheriff weighed them all, then folded the paper and tore it in half. "This claim won't stand," he said, "not against a life lived honest." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the square. Thomas turned to Clara, eyes wet, voice rough. "You gave me back more than land," he said. She shook her head. "No, you gave yourself the chance to be seen." That night, the wind was soft through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of spring and the sound of river song. In the quiet, Thomas reached for her hand, calloused, and she did not pull away. The fire burned low, steady as a heartbeat. For the first time, they did not feel the need to speak. Summer came slow and golden, the days stretching long beneath the unbroken sky. The river shrank back into its banks, leaving behind fields ripe with wild clover and the scent of sun-warmed earth. In the mornings, Clara rose before the heat, kneading dough by lamplight while Thomas split kindling outside. The rhythm of their lives had settled into something steady, something earned each day, a small testament to what endurance could build. The townsfolk now greeted her with nods, sometimes smiles. The name they'd once used to mock her had faded into the dust, replaced by quiet respect. Mothers brought sick children to her door. Ranchers came seeking salves for wounds and burns. Clara asked no payment. She took what they offered, a sack of grain, a jar of honey, a kind word, and gave what she could in return. The work filled her hands, but it was the trust in their eyes that mended her spirit. Yet even in peace, hosts stirred. At night, when the wind slipped through the boards, she would lie awake beside the fire, staring at the ceiling, remembering the coast she'd left behind, the cry of gulls, the crash of waves, the father buried beneath gray stones. The past was a tide that never stopped reaching, even across miles of prairie. Sometimes she wondered if she had been foolish to hope for more than survival. Thomas sensed the ache in her silence. He too carried shadows, the war he'd fled, the debts that had dragged him down, the years he'd spent wandering, trying to prove he was more than his mistakes. But when he watched Clara move through the light of their small cabin, her hair catching fire in the glow, her shoulders squared against hardship, he felt the stir of something holy, something that asked for courage beyond pride. One evening, they sat outside as the sun bled across the horizon, turning the sky to copper. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas. Thomas held a carved box in his lap, worn smooth from his hands. He opened it and drew out a ring, a simple band of braided silver wire, dull from years of keeping. "My mother's," he said. "She wore it when she came west, said it was a promise, not of riches, but of staying." He turned it in his fingers, hesitant. "I've no fortune to give you, Clara. Only land that fights me, and a heart that's slow to speak. But if you'll have it, I'd give you both." The words hung between them like smoke. Clara watched the river, the way it caught the last light and carried it away. She thought of all the miles she had walked, all the losses she had borne. Then she looked at the man beside her, scarred by weather and time, yet steady, true. "A promise built on labor and truth is more than I was ever offered," she said. "I'll take it." He slid the ring onto her finger, and though it was too large, it felt right like a circle closing after a long road. No cheers, no witnesses, only the hush of the plains and the slow breath they shared. Word spread, as it always did. Some said it was pity that bound them, others stubbornness. But those who had seen the way she stood against the flood, the way she met hardship without flinching, knew better. They saw two souls weathered by sorrow, choosing not to be alone. In the weeks that followed, they built together. Thomas raised a new fence, and Clara planted rows of beans and squash, her hands dark with soil. When storms came, they patched the roof side by side, laughing at the leaks that refused to stay mended. And in the quiet after, they would sit on the porch, watching lightning fade over the hills, knowing the worst had passed. By autumn, the land had softened to gold. Children from town came to gather apples from the small grove Thomas had nursed back to life. Clara baked pies for the harvest fair, her name spoken with gratitude rather than scorn. The preacher called her a pillar of grace. The blacksmith's wife said the Lord must have sent her west to heal what was broken. But Clara knew the truth. It was not grace or destiny that had remade her. It was work, grit, and the choice to stay when the world said she should go. She had not been saved. She had saved herself one day, one breath, one act of courage at a time. On the last evening before winter returned, she stood by the river, the air sharp with cold. Thomas joined her, his hand warm in hers. The horizon stretched endless, but for the first time, it did not feel empty. It felt like home. "Do you ever wonder," she said, her voice low, "if we were meant for this?" He smiled, small and sure. "No, I think we made it ourselves." The sun dipped below the hills, and the sky burned to ember. Behind them, the light from their cabin glowed soft and steady, an anchor in the vast dark. Clara tightened her fingers around his and breathed deep of the wild, living world. For the first time in her long, wandering years, she did not feel mocked, or bought, or lost. She felt chosen. She felt whole. The river murmured on, tireless and true, carrying their story into the quiet eternity of the plains.